The candles in the private card room burned low, but no one moved to call for more. Alexander Ravensworth stared at the cards in his hand, and for the first time in years, his heart beat faster than his pride could control. Across the table, his cousin Edmund Ashcombe wore a smile that promised trouble. "You cannot pay this debt, Alexander," Edmund said softly, so only the men at their table could hear. "Not with coin. Not tonight." Alexander set his cards down slowly. He had wagered more than money this time. He had wagered Ravenhollow, the estate his father had left him, the one piece of land that still felt like home, in a world that had taken almost everything else from him. He had been careless. He had been drunk on brandy, and on the false confidence that had never once failed him before tonight. "Name your price," Alexander said, keeping his voice even, though inside he felt the walls of the room closing in. Edmund leaned back in his chair, enjoying every second of it. The other men at the table, Lord Berkeley and young Mr. Finch, watched with open curiosity. Word of a duke's downfall was the kind of story that spread through London faster than fire through dry hay. "I do not want your money," Edmund said. "I want a wife for you." A ripple of laughter went around the table, though it was the nervous kind, the kind men give when they are not certain if they are allowed to laugh. "A wife," Alexander repeated flatly. "Yes, before the sun rises over London, you will be married, to whoever you meet first when you step outside these doors. If you refuse, Ravenhollow becomes mine by morning." Edmund's eyes gleamed. He had waited years for a moment like this, a chance to humiliate the cousin who had always outshone him, who had inherited the title Edmund believed should have been his. Alexander almost laughed at the sheer madness of it. Marriage was not a thing to be won or lost over cards. But he knew Edmund. He knew that once a wager was spoken aloud in front of witnesses, there was no walking away from it without being called a coward for the rest of his days. And a duke who was called a coward in London society might as well be dead. "Fine," Alexander said, standing so quickly his chair scraped against the wooden floor. "I accept." Lord Berkeley tried to reason with him. "Alexander, think about this. You cannot simply marry a stranger because of a foolish bet." "I have already agreed," Alexander said, pulling on his coat. "A Ravensworth does not break his word, even when his word is a mistake." He walked out into the night, without waiting for anyone to follow him. The cold air hit his face like a slap, sharp and clean after the smoke-filled room he had left behind. Rain had begun to fall, turning the cobblestones slick and shining under the gas lamps. Alexander pulled his collar up and began to walk, his mind spinning with the impossible promise he had just made. He told himself it did not matter who he met. He would simply find some old woman selling flowers, offer her a small fortune to play along for one night, and be done with the wager by morning. No real marriage would come of it. Edmund would learn nothing, except that his cousin could not be broken so easily. He turned the corner onto a narrow street, and that was when everything changed. A woman came running out of the shadows, moving with such speed that she nearly collided with him before either of them could stop. Alexander caught her by the shoulders instinctively, keeping her from falling onto the wet stones. She gasped, pulling back from him at once, her eyes wide with fear. "Forgive me," she said quickly, trying to step around him. "I did not see you." But Alexander did not let go of her arm just yet. There was something in her face, a rawness, a desperation, that he recognized, because he had felt something like it, only moments ago at the card table. She was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair coming loose from its pins, and a plain gray cloak that had seen better years. She was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with jewels or silk, and everything to do with the fire behind her eyes. "Are you being chased?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder toward the street she had come from. In the distance, Alexander could hear the heavy footsteps of a man calling out a name, angry and impatient. "Eleanor. Eleanor Hartley, come back here at once." The woman's face went pale. She looked at Alexander as though weighing whether he was friend or danger, and then made her choice. "Please," she whispered, "I need somewhere to go. Just for tonight." Alexander's mind raced. Here she was. The woman he was fated to meet, exactly as the wager demanded, standing before him not by choice but by chance, just as desperate to escape her circumstances as he was to escape his own foolishness. It seemed almost too strange to be real, and yet the footsteps behind her were growing louder. "Who is chasing you?" Alexander asked, stepping slightly in front of her. "My guardian," Eleanor said. "He has arranged a marriage for me to a man 3 times my age, a merchant who has already buried 2 wives. I will not become his third." Her voice shook, not with weakness but with anger. "I would rather sleep in the street than marry Mr. Grantham." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. An idea, wild and reckless, began to form in his mind, the same kind of idea that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. But perhaps, just perhaps, it could also get him out of it. "What if I offered you another option?" he said. Eleanor's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I do not know you, sir." "No," Alexander agreed. "You do not. But you know that whatever choice you make in the next few minutes will decide the rest of your life. I am offering you a way out that does not end with you locked away with a man who has buried 2 wives already." The footsteps were close now, just around the corner. Eleanor's guardian would appear any second, and whatever chance she had to choose her own fate would vanish with him. "Marry me," Alexander said simply. "Tonight, before sunrise." For a moment, Eleanor looked at him as though he had lost his mind entirely, and perhaps he had. But then her guardian's shadow fell across the mouth of the alley, and something in her expression hardened into resolve. "Yes," she said, "I accept." Neither of them fully understood what they had just agreed to, nor how deeply their lives were about to change. But as the rain fell harder around them, and the footsteps of the man chasing her grew closer, Alexander took Eleanor's hand and pulled her into a run, away from the alley, away from her guardian, and straight toward a future neither of them could have predicted just an hour before. Behind them, the guardian's furious shouts faded into the wet London night, swallowed by the sound of their footsteps on the stones and the pounding of 2 hearts that had, without warning, been tied together by nothing more than desperation, chance, and a dare made over a card table. They did not stop running until they had put several streets between themselves and the man who had wanted to sell Eleanor's future to the highest bidder. Alexander pulled her into the shelter of a covered doorway, both of them breathing hard, rain dripping from their hair and clothes. "You are truly willing to do this?" Alexander asked, studying her face in the dim light. He needed to be certain. Whatever game he was playing with Edmund, he would not drag an innocent woman into ruin without her full understanding. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I have spent 3 years under my guardian's roof, watching every choice about my life be made for me, by men who saw me only as a debt to be settled. I do not know you, sir, and I do not know what kind of man you truly are. But you are offering me a choice, and that alone is more than I have been given in a very long time." "I am not offering you romance," Alexander said honestly, feeling that she deserved at least that much truth. "This began as a wager between men who care nothing for either of our futures. But I will not treat you unkindly, and I will not ask more of you than you are willing to give." Eleanor studied him carefully, as if trying to read the truth of his character in the lines of his face. The day they invaded Earth, for the first time, the galaxy learned true fear. The burrito was cold. Alexander almost smiled at that. There was a boldness in her that surprised him, a refusal to be frightened, even when everything about her situation should have terrified her. He found himself, for the first time that night, thinking less about Edmund and Ravenhollow, and more about the strange woman walking beside him toward a church that would open its doors before dawn, for reasons neither of them could have imagined only hours before. Behind the darkened windows of London, few people slept peacefully that night. Somewhere across the city, Edmund waited smugly for news of his cousin's failure. Somewhere else, Eleanor's guardian searched the streets in a rage, already planning what lies he would tell to cover his loss. And somewhere between the rain and the gaslight, a duke and a stranger walked toward vows that would upend the lives of everyone who thought they understood how the story would end. Neither Alexander nor Eleanor could have guessed, as they walked in silence through the wet streets, that by morning, their names would be on the lips of every lord and lady in London, or that the marriage born from a dare and a desperate escape would become the very thing every man in that card room would soon envy beyond measure. The bells of St. Aldrich's Church had not yet rung for morning prayer when Alexander pounded on the heavy wooden door of the rectory. A startled young curate opened it, blinking sleep from his eyes, clearly unprepared for a duke and a rain-soaked young woman to appear on his doorstep before dawn. "Your Grace," the curate stammered, recognizing Alexander at once. Everyone in London recognized the Duke of Ravensworth, even half asleep in the dark hours before sunrise. What business could bring you here at this hour? I need a special license and a wedding, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the madness of his own request. Now, before the sun rises. The curate's eyes moved between Alexander and Eleanor, taking in her damp hair, her plain cloak, the fear still lingering behind her composed expression. Your Grace, surely this can wait until a more reasonable hour. It cannot, Alexander said firmly. I will pay whatever is necessary to have this done properly and quickly. Fetch Reverend Whitby if you must, but this marriage happens tonight. Something in his tone left no room for argument. The curate disappeared to wake the Reverend, leaving Alexander and Eleanor alone in the small stone entryway, lit by a single lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. You are certain of this? Alexander asked her again, quieter this time, away from the curate's ears. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, though whether from the cold or from nerves, Alexander could not tell. I have already told you, sir. I would rather take my chances with a stranger who offers me a choice than remain with a man who offers me none. My name is Alexander, he said. If we are to be married, you should at least know that much. A small, unexpected smile touched the corner of her mouth. Eleanor, she replied, though he already knew her name from the shouts that had chased her through the streets. Reverend Whitby arrived a few minutes later, an elderly man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, despite the early hour. He listened to Alexander's request with visible reluctance, glancing more than once at Eleanor, as though trying to determine whether she was being forced into something against her will. Miss, the Reverend said gently, addressing Eleanor directly, I must ask you plainly, do you enter this marriage of your own free choice, without pressure from any man in this room? Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting the Reverend's gaze without hesitation. I do, sir. This is my choice, and mine alone. Satisfied by her answer, though still clearly puzzled by the strangeness of the situation, Reverend Whitby agreed to perform the ceremony. The special license was drawn up quickly, Alexander's name and title carrying enough weight to smooth over any usual delays. Within the hour, the small chapel had been lit with a handful of candles, and Alexander and Eleanor stood before the altar, as witnesses to their own impossible decision. There was no gown of silk, no flowers, no gathering of friends and family to celebrate the union. There was only the sound of rain against the chapel windows, the flicker of candlelight, and two strangers speaking vows that neither had ever expected to say to one another. Do you, Alexander Ravensworth, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife? I do, Alexander said, and found that the words came out steadier than he expected. Do you, Eleanor Hartley, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband? Eleanor's voice trembled only slightly. I do. When Reverend Whitby pronounced them married, there was a strange, heavy silence in the chapel, as though even the walls themselves understood the weight of what had just occurred. Alexander looked at Eleanor, this stranger who was now his wife, and felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, something he could not yet name, but which unsettled him far more than the loss of Ravenhollow ever could have. They left the chapel, as the first grey light of dawn began to creep over the rooftops of London. The rain had softened into a light mist, and the city was beginning to stir, carts rattling over cobblestones, early vendors calling out their wares. Alexander helped Eleanor into his carriage, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. What happens now? Eleanor finally asked, watching the city pass by the window. Now, Alexander said slowly, we go to Ravensworth House, and you become my duchess in the eyes of all of London. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. They will not accept me. I have no fortune, no name that matters, no training in the ways of your world. They will accept you, Alexander said, though even he was not entirely certain of it, because you are my wife, and no one in London dares question the choices of a duke, however strange those choices may seem. He paused, studying her carefully. Besides, I suspect you are stronger than you realize, Eleanor. A woman who ran through the streets of London in the rain, rather than accept a life chosen for her, is not a woman who frightens easily. Eleanor turned to look at him, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. You know nothing about me, and yet you speak as though you understand me already. Perhaps I am simply hopeful, Alexander admitted. This marriage began as foolishness on my part, born from pride and a bad wager. But I intend to make certain that you do not suffer for my mistakes. Whatever comes next, you will not face it alone. The carriage rolled to a stop outside the tall iron gates of Ravensworth House, its stone walls rising grand and imposing against the pale morning sky. Eleanor stared up at it, at the enormous windows and the manicured gardens beyond the gates, and felt the full weight of what she had agreed to settle over her like a heavy cloak. "This is your home?" she asked quietly. "Our home now," Alexander corrected gently. As the carriage door opened and a footman hurried forward to assist them, Eleanor took a steadying breath. She thought of the life she had escaped only hours before, the fate that had awaited her with a man 3 times her age, a fate she had chosen not to accept. Whatever waited for her inside those grand doors, whatever judgment London society would pass upon her, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through the rain that night. Alexander offered her his arm, and after only a moment's hesitation, Eleanor took it. Together, they walked toward the entrance of Ravensworth House, toward a household of servants who did not yet know their master had returned home married, and toward a city that would wake within hours to news that would shock every drawing room from one end of London to the other. Neither of them could see, in that quiet morning moment, just how much their lives were about to change, or how the strange bargain that had bound them together would soon become something far deeper than either had dared to imagine. But as they crossed the threshold of Ravensworth House side by side, something had already shifted between them, subtle and unspoken, the first quiet beginnings of a bond that no wager, no scandal, and no scheme yet to come would be strong enough to break. Inside, the household staff gathered in the hallway at the sound of the front door, and the first gasps of shock rippled through the servants as they took in the sight of their master standing beside a woman none of them recognized, her plain gray cloak dripping rainwater onto the polished marble floor, her chin held high despite the uncertainty in her eyes. Word would travel through the servants' quarters within minutes, and from there, carried by messengers and morning callers, into the heart of London society itself, where by midday, the tale of the Duke's midnight marriage would become the only subject anyone cared to discuss. By the time the clock in the front hall struck 10, the knocker on the door of Ravensworth House had already sounded 3 times. Alexander stood in the study, staring out the window at the carriages beginning to gather along the street outside, each one carrying a curious lord or lady, eager to confirm the rumor with their own eyes. "They move quickly," he muttered. Behind him, Eleanor sat stiffly on a chaise, still wearing a borrowed morning dress that one of the maids had hurried to find for her. Her damp cloak had been taken away, her hair brushed and pinned by a nervous lady's maid, who clearly did not know what to make of her new mistress. Eleanor's hands were folded tightly in her lap, and though her face remained composed, Alexander could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "You do not have to face them today," Alexander said, turning from the window. "I can send word that you are unwell, that we will receive callers another time." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "If I hide from them today, they will believe I have something to hide. I would rather they see me now, while the story is still fresh, than wait and let their imaginations decide who I am, before I have the chance to show them myself." Alexander studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind his eyes. "You are braver than most men I know." Before Eleanor could respond, the study door opened, and a tall, elegant woman swept into the room, without waiting to be announced. She carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone who had never once in her life doubted her welcome anywhere. Her silver hair was pinned high, and her sharp eyes moved immediately from Alexander to Eleanor, studying the younger woman with an intensity that made Eleanor sit up straighter. "Grandmother," Alexander said, a note of resignation in his voice. "I see the news has already reached you." "The entire street has heard the news, Alexander," said Duchess Constance Ravensworth, settling herself into a chair without invitation. "I came the moment my maid told me, married, in secret, to a woman no one in London has ever heard of." She turned her full attention to Eleanor. "Stand up, girl. Let me look at you properly." Eleanor rose, her chin lifted despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. Duchess Constance circled her slowly, taking in every detail from the plain dress to the steady way Eleanor met her gaze without flinching. "What is your name?" the Duchess asked. "Eleanor Hartley, Your Grace. Now Eleanor Ravensworth, I suppose. And your family? Your fortune?" "My father was a bookkeeper. He passed 3 years ago. I have no fortune to speak of, only what small skills he taught me before he died." Eleanor's voice did not waver, even as she spoke the plain truth that many women in her position might have tried to soften or hide. Duchess Constance's eyebrows rose slightly. You admit this so freely. There is no use pretending otherwise, Your Grace. You will learn the truth eventually, and I would rather you hear it from me than from gossip that grows more twisted with every telling. For a long moment, the Duchess said nothing, simply studying Eleanor with an expression that gave away nothing of her thoughts. Alexander watched anxiously, unsure which way his grandmother's judgment would fall. Duchess Constance had buried 2 husbands, outlived most of her rivals, and held more influence over London society than nearly anyone else alive. Her opinion of Eleanor would matter a great deal in the days to come. At last, the Duchess allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch her lips. Well, at least you are not a simpering fool. That is more than I can say for half the young ladies my grandson has paraded through this house over the years. Grandmother, Alexander said warningly. Oh, hush, Alexander. I am simply stating facts. The Duchess turned back to Eleanor. You will need guidance, girl, if you intend to survive what is coming. London society does not forgive easily, and they will look for every reason to tear you apart. Do you understand what you have agreed to? I am beginning to, Eleanor admitted. Good, then you will listen carefully to what I tell you, and you will not waste my time with false modesty or excessive tears. Can you do that? Yes, Your Grace. The Duchess nodded once, satisfied, and turned to Alexander. You have made a great mess of things, as usual, but perhaps, for once, your foolishness has led to something worth salvaging. I will help the girl, Alexander, but only because I refuse to watch this family become a laughingstock while I still have breath in my body. Before Alexander could respond, the sound of raised voices reached them from the front hall. Moments later, the study door opened again, and Alexander's friend Lord Berkeley entered, followed closely by a young woman in an elegant blue gown whose expression was tight, with barely concealed anger. Alexander recognized her immediately, and his stomach sank. Miss Vane, he said carefully. Priscilla Vane had been, until very recently, the woman whose company Alexander kept most often at balls and dinners across the city, though no formal understanding had ever existed between them. Her cold eyes swept over Eleanor with obvious disdain. So the rumors are true, Priscilla said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. You married a bookkeeper's daughter over a card game wager. How very romantic, Your Grace. Priscilla, Alexander said, a warning edge entering his tone. I only wish to offer my congratulations, she continued, ignoring him entirely, her gaze fixed on Eleanor. Though I imagine adjusting to a duchess's duties will prove quite difficult for someone accustomed to counting coins rather than commanding servants. Eleanor felt the sting of the insult, but she refused to let it show on her face. Instead, she met Priscilla's gaze steadily. I imagine you are right that I have much to learn, Miss Vane. Fortunately, I have never shied away from difficult lessons. Tell me, what would you have done in my place last night, running through the rain from a guardian intent on selling me to a man old enough to be my grandfather? Would you have preferred I accept that fate quietly, so as not to inconvenience London society with an unexpected marriage? The room fell silent. Priscilla's mouth opened, then closed again, clearly unprepared for Eleanor to speak so directly. Duchess Constance let out a short, surprised laugh. Well said, girl, the Duchess murmured, clearly pleased. Priscilla's cheeks flushed with anger and embarrassment. Without another word, she turned on her heel and swept out of the room, Lord Berkeley trailing behind her with an apologetic glance toward Alexander before he too disappeared into the hallway. That, Duchess Constance said, once the door had closed again, was the first real test of your marriage, and you passed it admirably. There will be many more like her, Eleanor. London is full of women who built their entire identity on being seen with my grandson, and they will not forgive you easily for taking that position from them. I did not take anything from anyone, Eleanor said quietly. I only accepted an offer that was made to me. That distinction will matter very little to them, the Duchess replied. But it matters to me, and it should matter to Alexander as well. She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. I will return tomorrow to begin teaching you what you need to know. In the meantime, hold your head high, girl, and do not let anyone in this city convince you that you do not belong here. As the Duchess left the study, Alexander turned to Eleanor, something unfamiliar and warm settling in his chest as he watched her steady herself after the confrontation. You did not need to defend yourself so fiercely against Priscilla. I would have intervened. I did not marry you to be defended, Alexander, Eleanor said, meeting his eyes directly. I married you because it offered me a choice I did not have before. If I am to be your duchess, I intend to earn that place myself, not hide behind your protection every time someone questions whether I belong. Alexander studied her for a long moment, and for the first time since the wild events of the previous night, he felt something shift inside him, a recognition that the woman standing before him was far more remarkable than he could have possibly guessed when their paths first crossed in the rain. Whatever this marriage had begun as, he was beginning to suspect it would become something far greater than either of them had ever intended. Outside the study windows, London continued to buzz with gossip about the Duke's shocking marriage, carriages still rolling past Ravensworth House in the hope of catching a glimpse of the mysterious new Duchess. But inside those walls, Eleanor Hartley was already proving, one difficult conversation at a time, that she had no intention of being anyone's penalty, joke, or passing scandal. She intended to be exactly what she had promised the Reverend she would be that morning, a wife who had chosen her own fate, standing firmly on her own 2 feet. 3 days after the wedding, the ballroom at Ashcombe House glittered with candlelight as London's most influential families gathered for the season's first grand ball. Edmund Ashcombe had arranged the event with careful precision, knowing that his cousin Alexander could not refuse an invitation without appearing to hide, and that Eleanor's first true appearance among the highest ranks of society would either make or break her standing forever. "You look pale," Alexander said quietly, offering Eleanor his arm as they stepped from the carriage. "I am simply gathering my courage," Eleanor replied, though her grip on his arm tightened slightly as they approached the grand entrance. Duchess Constance had spent the last 3 days drilling Eleanor relentlessly on the rules of London society, teaching her the proper way to curtsy to a countess versus a viscountess, the correct topics of conversation at a dinner table, and 100 other small details that Eleanor had never needed to know in her previous life. She had absorbed every lesson with remarkable speed, but nothing could fully prepare a person for the moment they walked into a room full of strangers eager to judge them. The ballroom fell into a hush the moment Alexander and Eleanor entered. Heads turned, fans fluttered, and whispered conversations rippled outward like waves across the crowded room. Eleanor felt every eye upon her, measuring, judging, waiting for her to falter. She did not falter. Instead, Eleanor lifted her chin and walked beside Alexander with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through the rain 3 nights before. She curtsied correctly to the countesses, who approached her, answered their pointed questions with calm honesty, and revealed nothing of the nervousness churning beneath her composed exterior. "She is holding up remarkably well," Lord Berkeley murmured to Alexander, watching from across the room as Eleanor conversed politely with 2 elderly viscountesses who had clearly intended to fluster her. "I confess, I expected disaster." "So did I," Alexander admitted, unable to keep a note of pride from creeping into his voice. Across the ballroom, Edmund watched the scene with growing frustration. He had expected Eleanor to crumble under the weight of society's scrutiny, to prove herself an embarrassment that would force Alexander to regret his hasty marriage within days. Instead, she seemed to grow more assured with every passing hour, winning small victories in conversations that should have destroyed her. "She is more clever than we anticipated," Edmund muttered to Priscilla Vane, who stood beside him, still nursing the wound to her pride from days earlier. "Cleverness will not save her forever," Priscilla replied coldly. "Everyone has a weakness. We simply need to find hers." As the evening progressed, the orchestra began to play, and couples moved onto the dance floor. Alexander led Eleanor into the first dance of the evening, and for a moment, the calculating stares and whispered gossip of the room seemed to fade into the background. Eleanor moved with surprising grace, her earlier lessons with the Duchess's dance instructor clearly having taken root. "You dance well for someone who claimed she had never attended a proper ball," Alexander said, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I had a very determined teacher," Eleanor replied, a small smile finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "Your grandmother does not accept failure easily." "No," Alexander agreed, laughing softly. "She never has." As they turned through the steps of the dance, Alexander found himself studying Eleanor's face more closely than he had allowed himself to before. There was an intelligence in her eyes that went beyond mere survival instinct, a genuine curiosity about the world around her that seemed to grow stronger the more she was challenged. He had married her out of desperation and pride, expecting nothing more than a temporary arrangement to escape a foolish wager. But standing here now, watching her navigate a room full of people who wished to see her fail, he found himself wondering what other surprises she might hold. The dance ended, and as Alexander escorted Eleanor from the floor, an older gentleman approached them with obvious curiosity. Lord Pemberton was known throughout London as a man of considerable influence in Parliament, and his opinion carried weight in circles far beyond the ballroom. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberton said, addressing Eleanor directly with a respect that surprised many of the onlookers nearby. "I understand your late father was a bookkeeper. I wonder if you might be familiar with the recent debates surrounding trade tariffs. My own accounts have grown rather complicated of late, and I confess, most young ladies of my acquaintance have little patience for such dry matters." Eleanor's eyes lit up with genuine interest, and for the next several minutes, she engaged Lord Pemberton in a conversation about trade calculations and account balances that left the older gentleman visibly impressed. Several onlookers exchanged surprised glances, clearly not having expected the Duke's unconventional new wife to hold her own in a discussion typically reserved for men of business and politics. "Remarkable," Lord Pemberton said at last, bowing slightly to Eleanor before departing. "Your Grace, you have married a woman of genuine intelligence. That is rarer than you might think in this city." Alexander watched the exchange with growing admiration, but across the room, Edmund's frustration deepened into something colder and more calculating. If Eleanor could not be defeated through simple social embarrassment, he would need to find another way to unravel the marriage that threatened to make him the laughingstock of London instead of his cousin. Later that evening, as the ball began to wind down and guests started departing in their carriages, Duchess Constance found a quiet moment to speak with Eleanor near one of the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. "You exceeded my expectations tonight," the Duchess said, studying Eleanor with an expression that held something close to genuine warmth. "I did not think you would survive Lady Pemberton's questioning, let alone impress her husband so thoroughly." "I only spoke honestly," Eleanor replied. "I did not know how else to answer his questions." "Honesty is precisely what makes you dangerous to people like Priscilla Vane and my nephew Edmund," the Duchess said. "They have built their entire lives on pretense and careful performance. A woman who simply tells the truth and happens to be intelligent besides is a threat they do not know how to counter." Eleanor glanced across the ballroom to where Edmund stood watching them, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "I do not understand why your nephew hates his cousin so deeply. What did Alexander ever do to earn such resentment?" Duchess Constance's expression grew serious. "Edmund has spent his entire life believing he deserved the title that passed to Alexander instead. His father was the younger brother, and by the strange twists of inheritance, Edmund watched everything he believed should have been his slip through his fingers into Alexander's hands. He has never forgiven either Alexander or fate itself for that injustice, real or imagined." "Then he will not stop trying to destroy this marriage," Eleanor said quietly, understanding settling over her like a heavy weight. "No," the Duchess agreed, "he will not. Which means you must be prepared for whatever comes next, Eleanor. Edmund is patient, and he is clever in his own cruel way. Tonight was merely his first attempt to see if you would crumble under simple social pressure. When that fails, as it clearly has, he will search for something far more dangerous to use against you." As they spoke, Alexander approached, his expression softening as he looked at Eleanor standing beside his grandmother, the two women who mattered most to him now standing together in quiet alliance against whatever threats London society might still hold. "Are you ready to return home?" he asked Eleanor gently. "Yes," she said, though her mind remained occupied by the Duchess's warning. "I believe I have survived quite enough scrutiny for one evening." As they made their way toward the carriage, Eleanor glanced back one final time at the glittering ballroom, at the whispered conversations and calculating stares that would likely continue long after they had departed. She had passed the first true test of her new life, but she understood now, more clearly than ever, that the greater challenges still lay ahead. Somewhere in that crowded room, Edmund Ashcombe was already planning his next move, and Eleanor knew instinctively that whatever came next would test her far more severely than a single evening of polite conversation and careful dancing ever could. 2 weeks passed, and each day brought Eleanor further into the rhythms of her new life. She rose early each morning to review the household accounts with the housekeeper, a habit that startled the older woman at first but soon earned her quiet respect. She spent afternoons with Duchess Constance, learning the finer points of managing a great house, and evenings accompanying Alexander to dinners and gatherings, where she continued to win over skeptics, one careful conversation at a time. It was during one of these quiet mornings, as Eleanor sat in the study reviewing a stack of correspondence, that she discovered a discrepancy in the household ledgers that made her sit up sharply in her chair. She spread the pages across the desk, comparing figures with the careful attention her father had taught her years before, and realized that a significant sum of money had gone missing from the estate accounts over the past several months, disguised beneath a series of vague entries that any less careful eye would have overlooked entirely. When Alexander returned home that afternoon, Eleanor met him at the study door, the ledgers still clutched in her hands. "Alexander, I need to speak with you about something concerning," she said. He listened carefully as she explained what she had found, tracing the discrepancies through months of records, with a precision that left him both impressed and troubled. "Who has access to these accounts besides yourself and the steward?" "That is what concerns me," Eleanor said. "According to these entries, only 3 people have had the authority to approve these particular transactions. Yourself, the head steward, and your cousin Edmund, who I understand has managed certain estate matters on your behalf during your travels last year." Alexander's expression darkened. "Edmund handled several accounts while I was abroad, settling matters related to my father's remaining debts. I trusted him completely." "I am not accusing him without proof," Eleanor said carefully. "But someone has been diverting funds for quite some time, and the pattern suggests deliberate concealment rather than simple error." Alexander studied the ledgers himself, his jaw tightening as he followed Eleanor's careful notations through page after page of evidence. The picture that emerged was undeniable. Someone had been systematically siphoning money from the estate accounts, small enough amounts each time to avoid easy detection, but substantial enough over many months to add up to a considerable sum. "If this is Edmund's doing," Alexander said slowly, "it changes everything. This is not merely wounded pride driving his behavior toward us. This is theft." "We should proceed carefully," Eleanor cautioned. "If we confront him without absolute proof, he will simply deny everything and destroy whatever evidence remains. We need to be certain before we act." Alexander looked at his wife with newfound appreciation, recognizing in her careful, methodical approach the same intelligence that had first caught his attention at the ball weeks earlier. "You have found in a few hours what my own steward failed to notice in months. I am beginning to understand why my grandmother speaks so highly of you." Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I have simply had a great deal of practice looking for numbers that do not add up honestly. My father used to say that figures never lie, but the people who record them sometimes do." Over the following days, Eleanor and Alexander worked quietly together, cross-referencing records, speaking discreetly with trusted members of the household staff, and slowly building a clearer picture of the financial irregularities that had plagued the estate. The work brought them closer together, in ways neither had anticipated, when they first spoke their hurried vows in the candlelit chapel. Long evenings spent poring over documents gave way to easy conversation about matters far beyond estate business, and Alexander found himself increasingly drawn to moments spent simply talking with Eleanor, free from the watchful eyes of London society. "You never speak of your father," Alexander observed one evening, as they sat together in the study long after the household had retired for the night. Eleanor's expression softened with quiet grief. "He was a good man. Patient, honest, always willing to explain things twice if I did not understand the first time. He taught me everything I know about numbers and accounts, though he never expected I would need such skills to survive the way I have." "He would be proud of you," Alexander said gently. "I know I am." Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Something had shifted between them over these past weeks, subtle but undeniable, a warmth that had grown from careful respect into something that felt increasingly like genuine affection. "Alexander," she said softly, "when this began, you told me plainly that this marriage was not about romance. I understood that, and I accepted it. But I find myself wondering now whether either of us truly believed that would remain true forever." Alexander set down the papers in his hands, giving her his full attention. "I confess, Eleanor, that I did not expect to find myself looking forward to our evenings together. or missing your company on the rare occasions we are apart. Whatever this marriage began as, I no longer think of it as a penalty or a mistake. The quiet moment between them was interrupted by a soft knock at the study door. One of the household maids entered, looking nervous and uncertain. Your Grace, forgive the interruption. A letter arrived for you by messenger. The man insisted it was urgent. Alexander took the sealed letter, breaking it open as the maid withdrew. His expression shifted as he read the contents, concern replacing the warmth that had filled his features only moments before. What is it? Eleanor asked. It appears our careful investigation has not gone entirely unnoticed, Alexander said grimly, handing her the letter. Edmund has requested a private meeting tomorrow morning. He claims he wishes to discuss, in his words, certain matters concerning your background, that he believes I should know before this scandal grows any larger. Eleanor's stomach tightened with sudden dread. He knows we have been investigating the accounts. Or he suspects it, Alexander said. And now he intends to strike first, before we can gather enough proof to expose him. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkened garden below, her mind racing through the implications of Edmund's letter. Whatever secrets he believed he had uncovered about her past, whatever weapon he intended to use against their marriage, she understood now that the quiet, careful battle they had been fighting behind closed doors was about to become something far more public and far more dangerous. Whatever he says tomorrow, Eleanor said, turning back to face Alexander, her voice steady, despite the fear churning beneath her composed exterior. I want you to remember everything you have learned about me these past weeks. Do not let his words convince you that the woman standing before you now is anything less than exactly who I have shown you I am. Alexander crossed the room and took her hands in his expression fierce with a protectiveness that surprised even himself. Eleanor, nothing Edmund says tomorrow will change what I have come to know and admire about you. Whatever secret he believes he holds, I promise you, it will not be enough to undo what has grown between us these past weeks. But as the candles burned low and the household settled into uneasy silence around them, both Alexander and Eleanor understood that Edmund's meeting the following morning would mark the beginning of the most dangerous chapter of their unlikely marriage, one that would test not only their growing bond, but the very foundation of the choice they had made together in the rain 3 weeks before. Edmund arrived at Ravensworth House precisely at 10 the next morning, dressed in his finest coat, his expression carefully arranged into a mask of concerned civility that fooled no one who knew him well. Alexander received him in the study, with Eleanor seated nearby, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the tension coiled tightly beneath her composed exterior. Cousin, Edmund began, settling into a chair without waiting to be invited. I hope you understand that what I am about to share brings me no pleasure. I have only your best interests at heart. Say what you came to say, Edmund, Alexander replied coldly. Edmund's gaze flicked toward Eleanor with an expression of practiced sympathy. I have made certain inquiries into the background of your new wife. It seems her father's bookkeeping business did not end quite as respectably as she may have led you to believe. There were debts, Alexander. Significant debts, owed to several merchants across London, debts that remain unpaid to this day. Eleanor's chin lifted slightly, though her heart pounded painfully in her chest. My father's debts have nothing to do with the man I have become, or the wife I intend to be. Perhaps not, Edmund continued smoothly, but I wonder what London society will think when they learn that the Duke's new Duchess comes not merely from humble origins, but from a family drowning in unpaid obligations. Men have been ruined for less, cousin. Imagine what such news might do to your own standing, already fragile after this hasty, scandalous marriage. Alexander's expression remained carefully neutral, though Eleanor could see the tension building in the set of his jaw. Is that truly all you came to say, Edmund? A warning about debts that are, as you say yourself, matters concerning Eleanor's late father, and not Eleanor herself? I came to offer you a chance to correct your mistake before it destroys you entirely, Edmund said, his mask of concern slipping slightly to reveal the calculation beneath. An annulment could still be arranged quietly. The marriage was hasty, unconsummated in the eyes of society's assumptions, given how quickly it occurred, and easily explained away as a moment of temporary madness brought on by too much brandy. No one would blame you for correcting such an error. Eleanor felt the words strike her like a blow, though she refused to let her expression waver. Beside her, Alexander rose slowly from his chair, his voice dangerously quiet when he finally spoke. You misunderstand the purpose of your visit here today, Edmund, and I believe you misunderstand me as well. Did you truly believe that revealing my wife's father's old debts would frighten me into ending this marriage? Edmund's confidence wavered slightly. Alexander, be reasonable. I have been more than reasonable, Alexander said, his voice growing firmer with each word. I have watched you circle this family for years, waiting for any opportunity to claim what you believe should have been yours. I have overlooked your resentment, your bitterness, your constant efforts to undermine everything I have built. But I will not overlook an attempt to destroy my wife's reputation with information that reflects nothing of her own character. Her father's debts are irrelevant, Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady and clear despite the storm of emotion churning within her. I have never hidden my origins from anyone, Edmund. I told your grandmother the very first day that my father was a bookkeeper, with no fortune to speak of. If he left behind debts I did not know about, that changes nothing about who I am, or what I have shown this household these past weeks. Edmund's expression hardened, the pretense of concern finally abandoned entirely. You are both fools if you believe London society will be so forgiving. I will make certain everyone knows the truth about your precious Duchess, Alexander. By the end of the week, every drawing room in this city will be discussing the debts hanging over her family's name. Before you make good on that threat, Alexander said, his voice suddenly cold as steel, perhaps we should discuss another matter entirely. One concerning missing funds from this very estate's accounts, funds you had sole access to during my absence last year. The color drained from Edmund's face. I do not know what you mean. I believe you do, Eleanor said, retrieving the ledgers from the desk drawer and setting them before him with deliberate care. These discrepancies spanned several months, Edmund, each carefully disguised, each traced directly back to transactions only you had the authority to approve. I found them myself while reviewing the estate accounts. Would you care to explain these numbers to your cousin? Edmund stared at the ledgers, his carefully constructed composure crumbling before their eyes. This is nothing. Simple bookkeeping errors, easily explained. Then explain them, Alexander said flatly. Explain why nearly £3,000 has vanished from this estate's accounts under your management, disguised behind entries that any honest steward would never have created. The silence in the study stretched long and heavy. Edmund's eyes darted between Alexander's unyielding expression and the damning evidence spread across the desk, searching desperately for some escape from the trap that had closed around him. I only borrowed against future inheritance. I believed I was owed, Edmund finally said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. I intended to repay it eventually. You stole from this family, Alexander said, and then had the audacity to threaten my wife's reputation, to distract from your own crimes. I should have you brought before a magistrate this very afternoon. Alexander, please, Edmund said, all pretense of superiority gone now, replaced by genuine fear. Think of the family name. A public scandal involving theft would destroy us both. Eleanor watched the exchange with careful eyes, understanding that the moment held far more weight than simple confrontation. Whatever choice Alexander made now would define not only Edmund's fate, but the character of the man she had married. You will return every shilling you have taken, Alexander said finally, and you will leave London for a period of no less than 2 years, quietly, without further incident. If I hear even a whisper of you spreading rumors about my wife's family, I will bring these ledgers before a magistrate myself, and you will face whatever consequences follow, family name or not. Edmund's shoulders sagged with something between relief and humiliation. You would truly let me walk away so easily. I offer you this mercy for the sake of a family name you claim to value so highly, Alexander said. Do not mistake it for forgiveness, Edmund, and do not test the limits of my patience a second time. Edmund gathered what remained of his dignity and rose from his chair, casting one final glance toward Eleanor, his expression unreadable. You have won this round, it seems, Duchess. This was never a game to me, Eleanor replied quietly. I only ever wish to be judged fairly for who I am, not for circumstances beyond my control, or accusations meant to serve someone else's ambitions. Edmund said nothing further, gathering his coat and departing the study without another word. The heavy front door closed behind him minutes later, and the household fell into a strange, uneasy quiet. Alexander turned to Eleanor, exhaustion and relief mingling in his expression. "You handled that with remarkable composure." "I had a great deal of practice remaining calm while people tried to frighten me," Eleanor said, though her hands trembled slightly now that the confrontation had passed. "My guardian was fond of similar tactics, though far less clever than your cousin." Alexander stepped closer, taking her trembling hands gently in his own. "You are safe now, Eleanor. Whatever Edmund believed he could use against you, it holds no power any longer." "For now," Eleanor said. "But there will be others who hear whispers of my father's debts. Even if Edmund keeps his silence as promised. London society does not easily let go of scandal, even scandal built on half-truths. Then we will face whatever comes together," Alexander said firmly. "I promised you that morning in the carriage that you would not face this world alone, and I intend to keep that promise, whatever challenges still lie ahead." Eleanor looked up at him, something warm and hopeful blooming in her chest, despite the difficult morning behind them. Whatever fears remained about the challenges still to come, she found herself trusting, more completely than she had ever expected to, that the man standing before her would truly stand beside her through whatever trials awaited them both. Despite Edmund's promise to leave London quietly, whispers about Eleanor's father's old debts began circulating within days, spreading through drawing rooms and dinner parties, with the particular cruelty that only idle gossip could carry. Eleanor first noticed the change during a garden party hosted by Lady Whitmore, when conversations seemed to pause, and voices dropped to whispers whenever she approached a group of guests. "They know," Eleanor said quietly to Alexander, as they walked together along the garden path, putting distance between themselves and the curious stares following their every step. "We do not know that Edmund is the source," Alexander replied, though his expression suggested he suspected otherwise. "These things sometimes have a way of surfacing regardless." "It does not matter where the whispers originated," Eleanor said. "What matters is how I respond to them now that they have begun." That evening, at a formal dinner hosted by Lord and Lady Pemberton, the whispers finally became open confrontation. As the ladies retired to the drawing room after dinner, leaving the men to their brandy and conversation, one of the younger guests, a sharp-tongued baroness named Lady Ashford, addressed Eleanor directly in front of the assembled company. "I understand your family has quite a history with unpaid debts, Duchess," Lady Ashford said, her voice carrying just loud enough for the entire room to hear. "It must be difficult, adjusting to a life of such wealth when your own father could not manage his finances honestly." The room fell silent, every eye turning toward Eleanor, waiting to see how she would respond to such a direct and public insult. Eleanor felt her heart pound painfully, the old fear of judgment threatening to overwhelm her composure. But she thought of her father, of the honest, patient man who had taught her everything she knew, and she thought of Alexander's unwavering support, and she found her voice steady when she finally spoke. "My father struggled financially in his final years, that much is true," Eleanor said, meeting Lady Ashford's gaze without flinching. "He fell ill, unable to work as he once had, and the debts accumulated, as any families might under similar circumstances. I do not consider that a source of shame, Lady Ashford. I consider it a testament to how difficult life can become for those without inherited wealth to shield them from misfortune." Lady Ashford's confident smirk faltered slightly, clearly not having expected such a direct and unashamed response. "Perhaps," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger, "instead of judging families who face financial hardship through illness or misfortune, we might consider how fortunate those of us in this room are to have never faced such struggles ourselves. I do not believe wealth makes a person more worthy of respect than honesty and hard work, and I suspect my father, despite his debts, possessed more genuine character than many men who have never known a single day of financial difficulty." A murmur of surprised approval rippled through the room. Duchess Constance, seated nearby, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Even Lady Pemberton, the hostess of the evening, nodded slightly in agreement, her earlier reserved politeness toward Eleanor warming into something closer to genuine respect. Lady Ashford, clearly outmaneuvered, and unwilling to press the matter further in front of witnesses now sympathetic toward Eleanor, offered a stiff apology and quickly changed the subject. The remainder of the evening passed without further incident, and by the time Alexander and Eleanor departed for home, word of Eleanor's composed and dignified response had already begun spreading through the remaining guests. "You transformed what could have been a humiliation into something that earned you genuine respect," Alexander said admiringly, as their carriage rolled through the quiet London streets. "I only spoke the truth," Eleanor replied, though exhaustion from the confrontation was evident in her voice. "I am growing tired, Alexander, of constantly having to defend myself against people who judge me before they ever bother to know me." "I know," Alexander said gently, reaching for her hand, "but every time you face them with the courage you showed tonight, you win over a few more allies, and you weaken the position of those who wish to see you fail." Lady Pemberton's opinion alone carries significant weight in this city. Her approval tonight will matter a great deal in the weeks to come. Over the following days, Eleanor noticed a subtle shift in how London society treated her. Invitations that had once been offered reluctantly now came with genuine warmth. Ladies who had previously kept their distance began seeking her company at social gatherings, curious to hear more of the quiet strength that had so thoroughly humbled Lady Ashford at the Pemberton dinner. Even Priscilla Vane, though still cold toward Eleanor, no longer dared to openly insult her in public settings. Duchess Constance continued her careful guidance, though her lessons had evolved from simple etiquette into deeper conversations about the responsibilities and influence that came with Eleanor's new position. "You have a gift, Eleanor," the Duchess told her one afternoon, as they sat together reviewing correspondence from various charitable societies seeking the Duchess's patronage. "You speak truth in a way that disarms even the cruelest critics. Few people in this city possess such a talent." "I only say what I believe," Eleanor replied. "I have never learned the art of careful pretense that seems to guide so much of society's conversation." "That is precisely why it works so effectively," the Duchess said. "In a world built on careful performance and hidden agendas, genuine honesty becomes its own kind of power. You would do well to remember that as your influence in this city continues to grow." As the weeks progressed, Eleanor began to take a more active role in managing several charitable causes that Duchess Constance had long supported, finding genuine purpose in the work beyond simply surviving society's judgment. She organized fundraising efforts for a home supporting orphaned children, applying the same careful attention to detail she had once used to uncover Edmund's theft, ensuring every donated shilling reached those who truly needed it, rather than disappearing into administrative waste. Alexander watched his wife's transformation with growing admiration, and something that had, by now, undeniably become genuine love rather than simple respect or gratitude. The woman he had married in desperate haste, expecting nothing more than a temporary solution to an embarrassing wager, had become someone he could not imagine his life without. Their evenings together had grown warmer, filled with easy laughter and genuine conversation. The careful distance of their early days together long since dissolved into something far deeper. One evening, as they sat together in the garden behind Ravensworth House, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold across the London skyline, Alexander finally found the courage to voice what had been building in his heart for weeks. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I must confess something to you." "What is it?" she asked, turning to face him with genuine curiosity. "When I married you that night, I believed I was simply finding the easiest way to satisfy a foolish wager, to avoid losing Ravenhollow to Edmund's schemes. I never imagined that the woman I met running through the rain would become someone I could not bear to lose." He took her hands gently in his own. "I love you, Eleanor, not out of obligation, not out of gratitude for how gracefully you have handled society's judgment, but because you are genuinely the most remarkable woman I have ever known." Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming after weeks of maintaining careful composure in the face of every challenge London society had thrown at her. "Alexander, I did not dare hope that what began as desperation on both our parts could grow into something so genuine. I love you as well, more deeply than I believed possible given how our story began." As the last light of sunset faded into the soft blue of evening, Alexander drew Eleanor into his arms, and for the first time since their hurried vows in the candlelit chapel weeks before, both of them understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges London society still had in store for them, they would face every single one together, bound not merely by a dare or a desperate escape, but by a love that had grown stronger and more genuine with every trial they had overcome side by side. News that Edmund Ashcombe had suddenly departed London for the countryside, without explanation and without his usual circle of admirers, spread quickly through society, though few understood the true reason behind his abrupt disappearance. Whispers began to shift, some suggesting he had fallen into financial trouble of his own, others speculating that he had simply grown tired of watching his cousin's marriage flourish, despite every attempt to undermine it. Whatever the true story, his absence removed the last significant obstacle standing between Alexander and Eleanor's growing happiness. It was during the grand summer ball hosted by Duchess Constance herself, an event intended specifically to formally announce Eleanor's full acceptance into the highest circles of London society, that the true story of the wager finally became public knowledge. Lord Berkeley, having grown weary of watching Eleanor face lingering suspicion from those who still questioned the strange circumstances of her marriage, decided the time had come to set the record straight. Standing before the assembled guests during a lull in the evening's festivities, Lord Berkeley raised his glass and addressed the crowded ballroom with a booming voice that carried easily over the murmur of conversation. "I believe it is time," he announced, "that London finally hears the true story of how our esteemed Duke of Ravensworth came to marry his remarkable Duchess." Alexander shot his friend a startled glance, but Berkeley continued undeterred, recounting the tale of the reckless card game wager, Edmund's cruel intentions, and the desperate circumstances that had brought Alexander and Eleanor together on that rain-soaked London street. He spoke of Eleanor's courage in fleeing a forced marriage to a man 3 times her age, of the honest vows spoken before dawn in a candlelit chapel, and of the remarkable strength she had shown in the weeks that followed, facing society's harshest judgment with unwavering dignity. "What began as a foolish wager meant to humiliate my dear friend," Berkeley concluded, "has instead revealed the character of a woman who deserves every ounce of respect this room can offer. I have never in my life witnessed a marriage transformed so completely from desperate circumstance into genuine devotion. Gentlemen, I confess, I envy my friend Alexander his good fortune." The ballroom erupted into surprised murmurs, followed swiftly by genuine applause. Guests who had spent months whispering about the scandal now found themselves witnessing an entirely different narrative, one that painted Eleanor not as an embarrassing accident, but as a woman whose courage and character had earned her rightful place among them. Several gentlemen in the crowd exchanged glances of quiet envy, recognizing that the marriage they had once mocked as Alexander's humiliating penalty had instead become something many of them secretly wished for in their own lives, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, rather than the calculated arrangements that governed so many marriages within their circle. "It seems," Lord Pemberton remarked to his wife, watching Alexander pull Eleanor close for another dance, "that our Duke has stumbled into greater fortune than any of us realized. I dare say half the men in this room would trade their carefully arranged marriages for what he has found." As the music continued and the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers eager to offer their congratulations, their earlier suspicion transformed into genuine admiration. Even Lady Ashford, still smarting from her earlier humiliation at the Pemberton dinner, offered a stiff but sincere apology for her previous unkindness. Duchess Constance watched the transformation of the evening with quiet satisfaction, finding Alexander at the edge of the dance floor during a brief pause in the festivities. "You should thank Lord Berkeley for his timing," she said, "though I suspect the truth would have surfaced eventually regardless." "I am simply grateful the truth reflects well on Eleanor, rather than causing her further harm," Alexander replied, watching his wife across the room, laughing genuinely with a group of ladies who had once treated her with cold suspicion. "She has earned this acceptance through her own strength, Alexander, not through your protection or my guidance," the Duchess said. "Never forget that. Whatever fortune brought the two of you together that night, it was her own character that secured her place in this world." Later that evening, as the ball drew to its natural close and guests began departing into the warm summer night, Alexander found a quiet moment alone with Eleanor in the garden, away from the remaining crowd of well-wishers. "Do you feel it now?" he asked her softly. "The acceptance you worked so hard to earn?" Eleanor smiled, genuine happiness lighting her features in a way that had grown increasingly natural over the past months. "I feel something far more important than acceptance, Alexander. I feel at home, truly, at home, for the first time since my father passed away. Whatever fear or uncertainty followed me these past months, I no longer carry it the way I once did." "Good," Alexander said, drawing her close, "because I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never doubt your place here again." As they stood together beneath the summer stars, the sounds of the dispersing ball fading into the quiet night around them, both Alexander and Eleanor understood that whatever trials still awaited them in the years ahead, They had already weathered the greatest storm together, emerging not merely unbroken, but genuinely and deeply in love. The wager that had begun as a cruel joke, intended to humiliate a proud duke, had instead delivered him the greatest fortune of his life, a truth that every lord who had once mocked him now recognized with undeniable envy. Within the month, word had spread far beyond London itself, carried through letters and social correspondence to distant estates and country manors, of the duke who had married a stranger on a dare, and found in her not a penalty to be endured, but a partner whose strength, intelligence, and unwavering honesty had transformed his entire understanding of what marriage could truly mean. And though the circumstances of their union remained, forever, one of the most talked-about scandals London society had witnessed in years, no one who knew the full truth of their story could deny that the ending had proven far sweeter than anyone, including Alexander and Eleanor themselves, could have possibly imagined that rainy night when their paths first collided in the London streets. A year had passed since the night Eleanor first ran through the rain-soaked streets of London, and Ravensworth House had transformed alongside her, filled now with the warmth and laughter that had once seemed impossible within its grand stone walls. Eleanor stood in the same study where she had once nervously faced Duchess Constance's sharp questioning, though now the room felt entirely her own, lined with ledgers she managed with confident skill, and correspondence from charitable societies that had come to rely on her careful leadership. Alexander entered quietly, watching her for a moment before she noticed him, a small smile playing across his face. So much had changed since that desperate night, yet the quiet strength he had first glimpsed in her remained exactly the same, only stronger now, tempered by every challenge she had overcome. "You have that look again," Eleanor said without turning, having long since learned to sense his presence in a room. "What look is that?" Alexander asked, crossing to stand beside her. "The look you get when you are about to tell me something important," Eleanor replied, finally turning to face him with amused curiosity. Alexander laughed softly. "Edmund has written from the countryside. He wishes to return to London, having repaid every shilling he owed, and, by his own admission, having spent the past year reflecting on the man he wishes to become." Eleanor considered this news carefully. "Do you believe him?" "I believe people can change, given enough time and genuine reflection," Alexander said. "Whether Edmund has truly changed remains to be seen, but I am inclined to give him the opportunity to prove it, cautiously, and under careful watch." "Then we shall watch together," Eleanor said, "as we have faced everything else this past year." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Duchess Constance, who swept into the study with her usual commanding presence, though her expression carried unmistakable warmth these days, whenever she looked upon Eleanor. "I have wonderful news," the Duchess announced. "The orphanage fund you organized last spring has exceeded every expectation. Lady Pemberton tells me 3 other prominent families wish to establish similar charitable efforts, modeled entirely on your example." Eleanor felt genuine pride swell within her chest, a feeling that had grown increasingly familiar over the past year, as her influence and purpose within London society continued to expand far beyond what she had ever imagined possible on that first frightened morning at Ravensworth House. "You have built something remarkable here, Eleanor," the Duchess continued. "Not merely a marriage that survived scandal, but a genuine force for good within this city. I confess, I did not expect such an outcome when Alexander first brought you through those doors, soaked and trembling from the rain." "None of us expected this outcome," Alexander said, reaching for Eleanor's hand. "But I have never once regretted the wager that brought her into my life, foolish as it was in the beginning." As summer settled fully over London, bringing warm afternoons and long, golden evenings, Alexander and Eleanor found themselves increasingly sought after by society, not merely as curiosities from a scandalous beginning, but as genuine leaders whose marriage had become something many aspired to emulate. Young couples facing their own arranged matches often sought Eleanor's quiet counsel, hoping to learn how honesty and mutual respect might transform even the most difficult circumstances into genuine happiness. Lord Berkeley, ever the loyal friend, often remarked with good humor that half the gentlemen's clubs across London had grown quieter since word of Alexander's transformation spread, several young lords having grown weary of reckless wagers after witnessing how thoroughly one had reshaped their friend's entire life for the better. One evening, as Alexander and Eleanor walked together through the same gardens where they had once quietly confessed their growing love beneath a summer sunset, Eleanor paused beside a small stone bench, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think of that night?" she asked. "The rain, the fear, the strange desperation that brought us together?" "Often," Alexander admitted, "though I no longer feel the shame I once carried over how our marriage began. I have come to see that night not as a mistake born from foolish pride, but as the strange and unexpected beginning of the greatest fortune I have ever known." Eleanor smiled, settling onto the bench beside him, the golden evening light casting warm shadows across the garden they had come to think of as their own private sanctuary. "I remember being so afraid that night, certain I was simply trading one uncertain fate for another. I never imagined I would find genuine happiness, let alone genuine love, from such a desperate beginning." "Fate has a strange way of working itself out," Alexander said, drawing her close. "A cruel wager meant to humiliate me instead delivered the truest partner I could have ever hoped to find." As the stars began to emerge over London's rooftops, casting their familiar glow over a city that had once judged Eleanor so harshly, and now celebrated her as one of its most respected figures, Alexander and Eleanor sat together in comfortable silence, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future still held, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything since that fateful rainy night, together, honestly, and with a love that had grown far beyond anything either of them could have possibly imagined when a desperate dare first brought them crashing into each other's lives. The story of the Duke who married a stranger on a dare, and found in her not a penalty to endure but the truest joy of his life, remained one of London's most cherished tales for years to come, told and retold in drawing rooms across the city, always ending the same way, with every lord who once mocked Alexander's misfortune, quietly wishing, in the privacy of his own heart, that he too might be fortunate enough to lose such a wager.